Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to AIA Contract Documents webinar on demystifying the payment application process. So before we begin, I just want to say that you will receive the slides and recording of the presentation over email from AIA Contract Documents after the program. So keep an eye out for that. And then a quick disclaimer here, please just remember that any of the content we go over today should not be acted upon as legal advice. We'll be going over some standard forms, but if you have any particular issues that you feel need legal attention, we recommend you seek out a local attorney. And finally, this presentation is also protected by copyright laws. And with the fun stuff out of the way, I'm going to hand it over to our presenters for today, Mark and Josh, to take you through the real content here. And I'll be back for some Q&A at the end. So Mark and Josh, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. And hello, everyone. I'm Josh Flowers. I'm located in Nashville, Tennessee, and work with Gresham Smith, which is a firm of about 1,000 architects and engineers. And joined by Mark Baum, who's located in New Orleans. So before we get into the content, we wanted to share a little bit of information about the AIA documents and the process that's used to create them. And these documents have been around for a little over 130 years. So there's a long history of preparing these forms with the interest of all of the parties and trying to strike the right balance in the interest of the project. So the goal with these is to provide a standard for the industry for all of the different forms and the uses that they support. There's a process that we use to create the documents by trying to engage the different perspectives across the industry to make sure that we are hearing from those voices that are important to the process during creation of the documents. So both Mark and I serve on the AIA Documents Committee. It's a group of about 35 volunteers, and we do engage a lot of different liaisons and industry representatives outside of the committee during that process, in addition to attorneys and insurance representatives and staff with the AIA. Our objectives for today will be to look at the payment application process, and we'll do that by considering the roles of the primary participants. We'll look at the architect, the contractor, and the owner and consider their perspectives on these issues. We want to look at the format and structure of the AIA G702 and G703 to help us understand how that form is used and is critical in the payment application and certification process. And then we'll talk about best practices for preparing the schedule of values and considerations for the parties when that document is prepared at different stages. And we will also look at the application for payment and consider how that document requires input from the different parties as well. So we will start by considering the different perspectives of the architect, owner, and contractor. Beginning with the architect, what is the architect's consideration when they are approaching this process in particular? One of the things that the architect will be considering is its preparation of the contract documents will include references to the payment application process. That is not the only time that the architect will prepare that information. There will be the agreement between the owner and architect that will contain some payment information with regard to the scope of the architect's responsibilities in the review and certification of payment. So that document is not part of the contract documents, but is important from the perspective of the architect as well as the owner, because it can include some limitations and requirements with regard to the architect's role in this process. But the architect will provide reference to the application for payment, the certification of payment, and the schedule of values within the Division 1 specifications. And that is something that the party should review and coordinate to make sure that it serves the needs of the project. The architect will also work with the owner to make sure that in the certification process that the owner is protected as far as the needs of the sequence of events that will be used to prepare the application and certification for payment. So if there's an amount that's requested, the architect will have a role in its on-site observations, first of all, in determining the progress of the work and making sure that there is nothing that the architect has observed that would constitute non-conforming work that has failed to meet the requirements of the contract documents. And we'll talk a little bit later about what are the reasons that would be valid for withholding payment. But that is where the process starts, is through the architect's observation leading up to each periodic payment throughout the project. And then we'll talk about how to ensure that the contractor receives its entitled payment, because the architect has a role in certifying that, and then that triggers timing that has to be met by the owner as well as the contractor after payment is received. Now looking at the perspective of the contractor is looking at how does the schedule of values support the process itself, and making sure that the schedule of values is prepared in accordance with the requirements of the specifications or other contract documents that we discussed with regard to the architect, and making sure that as these documents are submitted, that they meet the requirements of the contract documents and that there should be no issues with timing as a result of format or other issues of that nature. The contractor is concerned about certifying that the work has been completed, that there is no non-conforming work, and if there are issues like that, that they are addressed in a timely manner that does not cause a delay in the payment process. The contractor will also look at what supporting documentation is required by its agreement with the owner, the contract documents themselves, and the contractor will also be responsible for making payment to its subcontractors and suppliers and potentially providing documentation of that back to the owner. And then what is the perspective of the owner in this process? We've referred to the owner already because it's preparing the agreements for the architect and the contractor and negotiating those documents. And in that process, the owner has to consider, are there any issues that need to show up with regard to this specific project that would affect use of forms for those agreements, and making sure that where the agreements refer to the payment process, that the owner has provided appropriate legal provisions to reflect any specific requirements for the project. And part of that could involve if there are requirements from a lender or other funding source that require special review each time payment is made. The owner would need to make sure that that process has been thought through and that it can show up in the document so that the process proceeds as intended and that all of the requirements are met once the certification of payment is issued.
Thank you, Josh. Good afternoon. I'm Mark Baum. I have a consulting practice in New Orleans and have been a member of the AIA Documents Committee for 2 years. We will now dive into the format and structure of the G702 application and certificate for payment, the G703 continuation sheet, and how they relate to one another. As the totals of the continuation sheet feed into the application, I will first discuss the G703 continuation sheet, and then Josh will discuss the 702 application. The G703 continuation sheet provides the architect and the owner an overview and understanding of the status of completion of each cost item of the project. In this segment, we will review in detail the 10 columns of information for each cost item. The totals of certain columns of the G703 will then populate the G702 application. Although most documents are in Word format, uniquely to facilitate calculations across each line item and the totals of the columns, the G703 is formatted as a spreadsheet in the AIA ACD online software. It provides for an unlimited number of rows which can easily be added or deleted, and values from Excel files or any tab-delimited spreadsheet program can be cut and pasted right into the online editor. For discussion, I'll break the columns down into 3 groups: the schedule of values columns A, B, and C, the work completed columns D, E, and F, and the reconciliation columns G, H, and I. Let's discuss the first 3 columns which make up the contractor's schedule of values. It is the information in these columns which must be reviewed and approved by the architect prior to the initial application for payment. Column A will accommodate an alphanumeric item number. Typically, this is the section number of the relevant specification section for the cost item, frequently followed by unique sub-numbers for each cost item within that section, allowing quick reference by the parties reviewing the application. Column B, description of work, typically includes an abbreviated description of the cost item or specification section, such as openings, solid core wood doors, along with a brief description of the sub-portion of work included in the cost item. This might be a sub-portion of the work under the spec section, or it may designate that the cost item is for either labor, materials, or equipment. Column C is the scheduled value for the cost item. It is recommended that a maximum value for any single cost item be established in the requirements under the payment section in Division 1. Commonly, for all but large projects, very large projects, the amount may be set in the $25,000 to $50,000 range, including situations where the amount, excluding situations where the amount cannot be further broken down, such as where the cost of a single piece of equipment, such as a cooling tower, may exceed that amount. In my practice, I require that the contractor schedule of values includes sufficient detail to enable my office to efficiently evaluate the completion status of the project each month. For example, drywall work should be broken down into materials, labor to hang, labor to tape and float, and labor to finish. This, in contrast to a single cost item for all drywall, allows us to quickly and accurately establish a percentage of completion of each step in the process of the installation and finishing process, and therefore the overall amount of work completed with respect to the drywall. Now let's move to the work completed columns, D, E, and F. Column D simply captures the total of work completed from previous applications. The formula in parentheses and italic below the heading indicates that this column includes a total of columns D and E from the previous application. This column, of course, is left blank or as zeros in the initial application for payment. Column E is the work completed this period. This is the primary column that must be reviewed by the architect and its consultants each month. Section 4.2.5 of the A201 stipulates, based on the architect's evaluations of the contractor's applications for payment, the architect will review and certify the amounts due the contractor and will issue certificates for payment in such amounts. Column F is for materials presently stored. This includes materials stored at the job site, but not yet incorporated into the work, and, if permitted by contract, materials suitably stored off-site. As the title to these materials transfers to the owner upon payment, the construction contract commonly requires that the materials stored off-site are to be secured in a bonded and insured facility. In subsequent applications, once the previously stored materials are incorporated into the work, the amounts claimed in this column are moved to column D, work completed from previous applications. This movement of funds is commonly misunderstood, with amounts oftentimes moved into subsequent applications to column E, work completed this period, rather than column D, as the stored materials are already paid for by the owner and included in a previous application. In order to avoid a mathematical error when transferring the information to the G702 application, once such materials are incorporated into the work, the value is to be added to column D, work completed from previous applications. The reconciliation columns G, H, and I are next. Column G, total amount completed and stored to date, actually contains two columns, including a dollar value column to the left and a column which calculates the percentage of completion for that cost item to the right. The left-hand column under G is the total of columns D, previous application for payment, column E, work completed this period, and column F, stored materials. For the right-hand column under G, the percentage is automatically calculated in the form and is the left-hand column G divided by the schedule value in column C. These columns provide the architect with two means of evaluating the cost item, either on the stated sum of completed work or as a percentage of the completion of work. Column H indicates the balance to finish, which is the scheduled value in column C minus column G, the total amount completed and stored to date. Pretty simple. Column I is for retainage. Retainage is the amount required by contract to be held to protect the owner from liens. It is not intended to be a bucket of money used for incomplete or defective work or to cover the value of the punch list. If the retainage is a set percentage for the entire project, this column is not used, but instead the retainage is simply calculated on the G702 application as a percentage of the total amount completed and stored to date. If the contract allows a variable amount of retainage for certain portions of the work, or if portions of the retainage are allowed to be released early, then the amounts for each cost item are to be stipulated in this column. The total of certain columns at the bottom of the G703, which are automatically calculated by the software, are carried forward into the G702 application. Josh will now discuss that G702 application, certification, and payment, and talk about which information from the G703 will be transferred to the G702. Josh?
So as Mark said, the continuation sheet is providing the foundation for the application and certification of payment. And you can see how that looks on the G702 in the slide here. And one of the things that's important about this is it's providing a snapshot at any point in the project of how much progress has been made, payment that's still to be issued, payment that has previously been made, and all of the calculations will be shown on each version of this as the project progresses. So what are we looking for on this document? It's going to provide that summary of the financial status for the project. It also provides some provisions of legal significance. The first one will be that the contractor is making its application for payment, and as part of doing that, it's required to make a certification not just to the owner, but also to the architect, and the language for the contractor's certification is contained on this form. There's also, as we mentioned earlier, the architect certification, where the architect is making its review and then providing a certification to the owner, and the language for that certification is also contained in this form. So there's a lot going on in this one page of information. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind with this is the whole process of payment, application, and certification is about all the parties receiving payment and making payment in a timely manner, but it's also creating important records for the project that may be referred to in the future. So it's important to make sure that the information that's contained in these forms is accurate, because it has that significance and you want to be able to refer back to it if needed. And then what financial information is contained on this form? You can see that there's a reference to the original contract sum, and that would be taken from the agreement itself. But then there are changes that are made to that, and there will be a reflection of the change orders that have been recorded throughout the project, and then that will give you the contract sum as of that date. And then in line item number 4, there's a reference to complete and stored items. So that would be taken from the G703 as we saw. There's also the reference to the retainage on this form. So if the agreement requires a retainage to be withheld on payments, that would need to be calculated on this form. And then as retainage is released later in the project, you would need to make sure that you're referencing the correct amounts that have been withheld over the course of the project. And then there is a reference to the earned retainage, and that would be calculated and withheld. And then there's also the previous certificates for payment that will show up on this form. So there's the reference to the past payments, and then there's also what is the current amount that is to be paid, which is the subject of this particular application. So whatever the period for payment is, typically if it's monthly on a project, and there's one of these forms that is completed every month, you'll be looking for what is the amount that's to be paid for that month. And usually that number is subject to a lot of review. If there are changes that are to be made, there may be recalculations and other things before the form can be completed and the certificates provided as needed. And then that will give a balance to finish so that you have that moving target and can refer to it as progress is made and the project moves forward. And then the last item to look at on this, there is the worksheet for the change orders, and that information will be entered and then will be used to calculate the items above. If there are change orders as they are executed for the project, that will then change the contract sum when the change orders are approved. And this information can be entered here on the certificate of payment and used to reflect that number. So you're looking for what are the total approved changes during the period. If it's monthly for the project, then it would show everything that has been executed over the course of that month. And then that will give you those net changes for the change orders and refer back to the number at the top and then calculate down from there again. Now we want to look at the particular language. We referred to this before and said that there are statements contained on this in addition to the financial information that do have that legal significance. So first, the contractor's application for payment does require that certification, and the contractor is saying that to its knowledge, information, and belief, the work covered by this application has been completed in accordance with the contract documents, and that the contractor has paid its subcontractors and suppliers. It's also saying that the current payment shown is in fact due under the agreement. So there's a lot that the contractor has to review before it's able to make these certifications to the owner and architect, and that requires the timing to be accurate as far as moving forward with being able to say that this information is correct at that point in time. And then once the contractor is able to state that, then the architect will go back and verify that to its knowledge, information, and belief, the contractor is entitled to payment. And that does require the architect's observation. If there's anything else that the architect is aware of that would prevent it from signing the certificate, then there should be time for the parties to work through that if needed in order to resolve those issues and move forward with payment in a timely manner, or if there's a need to withhold payment, we'll look at what some of those reasons would be. But this is something where the language that's contained on these forms is intended to reflect the requirements of the parties' agreements. So the agreements would have been signed at the outset of the project, but should refer to the documents that will be used over the course of the project itself. So this language should be complementary. If you see that there are things in conflict, it's something that would need to be resolved in the agreements and make sure that there aren't any conflicts that would show discrepancies between this language and what's contained in the owner's agreement with the contractor and the owner's agreement with the architect. So the agreements themselves should be reflected in this language. And it's something that you would want to make sure is coordinated throughout the contract documents. If it shows up in language in the specifications or elsewhere, you want to use that language and be consistent throughout all of the documents.
Thank you, Josh. We will now discuss the best practices in the preparation of the schedule of values. The backbone of the G703 continuation sheet is the contractor's schedule of values. Through the course of this webinar, we've touched on a few requirements from the A201 general conditions of the contract for construction. Contractual requirements relevant to the certificate for payment are found in Articles 2, 4, 7, 9, 13, and 14 of the A201. Article 9, payments and completion, is specific to the schedule of values, the application for payment process, the certificate for payment, the decisions to withhold certification, progress payments, and other related requirements. The schedule of values is addressed in section 9.2 as follows, where the contract is based on a stipulated sum or guaranteed maximum price. The contractor shall submit a schedule of values to the architect before the first application for payment, allocating the entire contract to the various portions of the work. The schedule of values shall be prepared in a form and supported by the data to substantiate its accuracy required by the architect. The key language here is required by the architect. Therefore, the requirements of the architect must be spelled out in the contract documents and are typically addressed in Division 1, Section 12-900 Payment Procedures. Schedule 9.2 goes on to stipulate this schedule, unless objected to by the architect, shall be used as a basis for reviewing the contractor's application for payment. Any changes to the schedule values shall be submitted to the architect and supported by such data to substantiate its accuracy as the architect may require, and unless objected to by the architect, shall be used as a basis for reviewing the contractor's subsequent applications for payment. Following are examples of some of the best practice provisions in Master Spec Section 12-900. Primarily, this portion reviews the coordination. The contractor shall coordinate the schedule of values with the contractor's construction schedule. In other words, the cost items are intended to be broken down in a manner that follows and respects the contractor's schedule. For example, on a project with multiple phases, cost items are to be provided for each trade for each phase of the schedule. Similarly, if the project has multiple floors or areas, individual cost items are to be provided for the work for each trade on each floor or area, permitting each floor or area's state of completion to be evaluated by the architect each month. It's very difficult, as everyone probably knows, to evaluate an entire building if the different portions of the building are at different phases or different stages of construction. So that's why the breakdown by stage, by phase, or area is critical. The contractor shall submit the schedule of values to the architect for review sufficiently in advance of the initial application for payment to assure timely approval. As mentioned, if the project is phased, the schedule of values is to be arranged accordingly. If the contract contains subschedules within the phased work, cost items corresponding to subschedules are also to be provided. If they're separate elements of the work, cost items corresponding to subschedules for those separate elements to be provided. And lastly, if the contract work is defined by the contract documents and prepared under multiple design contracts, cost items corresponding to those separate design contracts would be provided. This might occur where interior build-out documents, although under the same construction contract, are prepared by a different professional record than the building shell, or where abatement work is specified by the owner's separate abatement consultant. In such cases, each of these professionals of record will be individually reviewing its respective cost items on the monthly application, and therefore you cannot commingle them because each consultant is going to have to take responsibility for its own review. The payment section also addresses best practices regarding format and content. The contractor shall use the project manual's table of contents as a guide for establishing schedule of value cost items. Ideally, each item is tied to its respective specification section, regardless of how the contractor buys out the project. The contractor is to be broken down in adequate detail to facilitate continued evaluation of applications for payment. This is key to avoiding arguments as to the architect's monthly evaluation of the work completed. As previously discussed, multiple cost items for principal subcontractor amounts in excess of a percentage of the contract sum or a top dollar value are to be provided. Our office prefers to stipulate a maximum dollar amount that is used across the board. General conditions costs also should be broken down in detail. We recommend separately identifying costs incurred at the beginning of the project, costs incurred on a monthly basis, costs incurred at closeout, all allowing the contractor to request payment as such expenditures are made. Typically, those costs regularly incurred over the course of the project are evenly divided by the number of months in the schedule, or may be tied to the percentage completion each month. And separately identifying costs with respect to lead or other similar required documentation, which costs may be incurred at specific milestones in the schedule. Individual cost items will be provided for labor, materials, and equipment, as we mentioned, although this level of detail may not always be necessary for small cost items. Cost items for anticipated stored materials are to be individually listed as well. And for each allowance, for each unit price, for each purchase contract, separate line items are to be provided. Okay, so let's recap the most important requirements for establishing and agreeing to an appropriately detailed schedule of values at the onset of the project. First, an adequate breakdown of the contract sum is to be provided. Second, a detailed general conditions breakdown is to be provided, separately identifying startup and mobilization expenses, monthly recurring expenses, demobilization and closeout expenses, and documentation requirements that may be special to the project. A breakdown of costs and the specification divisions is also to be provided. The breakdown is to reflect how the contractor intends by its own schedule to perform the work. Schedule of values to provide individual line items for materials, labor, and equipment. A maximum value for any single line item should be established. And large portions of the work by floor, area, facade, etc. are to be broken down. And finally, the goal of all this is to avoid monthly disputes as to the value of the completed work. To the greatest extent that these breakdowns can be agreed to in advance, there should be very little discussion as to what level of completion is for each portion of the work. So I'm going to turn it back over to Josh, and he's going to talk about the preparation of the application along with required supporting documentation to be submitted each month. Josh?
Thanks, Mark. So one of the considerations is, how is the percent of completed work determined, and how does the contractor make that certification? One of the things that the contractor may be looking for is going back to the project schedule and identifying the milestones and making sure that the required milestones have been met, and then it should be able to certify that information over the course of the project. And the architect will be making its evaluation of completed work in the field through its on-site observations. And the architect will be verifying if it agrees with the contractor certification, or if there are any discrepancies, making note of that through field reports or other agreed upon documentation. Part of what the architect may be looking for is its consultant's review of work that's completed within those consultant disciplines. So depending on the number of consultants that have work that has been completed during a period for payment, there may be multiple parties that will have to review work in progress in order to complete one application and certification for payment. So as the project advances on the schedule, the review for this process can become more complex with more parties participating. And that's something that has to be considered on the schedule. If there are things that needs to be reviewed, typically there will be some preliminary version of these documents that would be reviewed among the parties so that they are able to identify the issues and resolve them if possible. If there's a pencil copy or other type of document that can be reviewed based on those observations and then addressed before the final versions are prepared. And then evaluating the change orders as we reviewed earlier and making sure that that has been completed as well. So there may be other documents that have been modified or added to the contract documents that will be subject to this period in time that would have to be reviewed at that time as well. So we've talked about the process and how it's supposed to proceed and the steps that would need to be taken in order for payment to be made in a timely manner. And then what are the obstacles that could prevent that from happening? And those are the reasons for withholding certification. And these would come from the language of the agreement. There should be clear language that would state what the basis would be for withholding payment, because this is a potentially serious decision that has implications for everyone participating in the project that could be very far reaching depending on what the issue is. So let's look at some of the examples. There could be defective work that has not been remedied. And if that is the case, there may be records of what was the defective work and what action was required to be taken and who was responsible. And you would want to make sure that that has been clearly documented and can be referred to in the future. There could be third-party claims that would be a basis for withholding payment if the contractor is responsible for a third-party claim that impacts the owner. There could be language in the agreement that would give the owner the right to withhold certification of payment for that reason, and that would require that the claim would be resolved to the extent required by the documents in order for that payment to then be released. There could be a failure of the contractor to make payments to its subs and suppliers, or to provide documentation required under the agreements that it has made those payments. There could be work that was not completed or an unpaid balance of the contract sum. One of the other reasons could be if the contractor has caused some type of damage, maybe to the work itself or to surrounding property or other damage that is part of basis for withholding under the documents. There could be a separate contractor, there could be others participating that the contractor is responsible for. All of those could be reasons for withholding. There could also be liquidated damages, and that would be something that is included in the owner contractor agreement at the outset. And if that is triggered over the course of the project, the liquidated damages may be deducted from the otherwise due amount under the application for payment. And then if there is that repeated failure to carry out the work, that would also be included in the documents and maybe further basis for a withholding of payment. We've talked about some of the supporting documentation that's required to be included with this. And this point gets back to the importance of the records that are being created by the parties as this progresses. We've said that it's about being paid, but it's also about the record keeping process. And so the items that are listed here refer to the importance of the records themselves. There is the initial application for payment. So the first time that the parties go through this is usually different from the subsequent times that this process will play out, because there will be initial documents that are required. Some of those would be the list of the subcontractors, the initial schedule that has been approved, the building permits may be submitted at that time if there are bonds required under the documents, and then there could be enumerated documents that would be part of this initial application for payment. And all of those would need to be received and reviewed and verified that they comply with any requirements in order to release that initial payment. And then as the process moves forward each month, there would be documents that are submitted repeatedly as part of the process. So we said non-payment to subs and suppliers would be an issue, and receiving that documentation. The lien waivers are what the parties would be looking for that verification that everyone has been paid for previous payments. There may be an updated schedule that's provided each time. If wage reports or DBE requirements are part of the project, then that is something that would need to be provided. And then we've referred to liquidated damages. If that is something that is being documented in an application and certification for payment, then you would need the required documentation of what liquidated damages have been assessed, how that has been made under the contract, and what the remedy would be, and what progress has been made toward any remedy, or if there is liquidated damages that are already moving forward and have been documented, then it would show up there. And then other documentation that would be required each month should be clearly spelled out so that everyone knows what's intended to be provided and what should be reviewed and verified each month. And as the project reaches completion, there would be other additional documentation that would be part of this process. First, at substantial completion, once the project reaches that stage where it's able to be used for its intended purpose, that may be the cause for releasing some retainage. There could be other payments that are required to be made at that time. And that's something that would need to be reviewed during the process. So part of that may include the punch list and the preparation of the punch list by the contractor, by its subs, by the architect, and reviewing the punch list and adding to those items so that there's a list of items to be completed or corrected prior to final completion and final payment. And then the release of retainage as it's intended to be released under the documents. If there is a timing for that that is spelled out, that may require that there is a lien and privilege certificate that the parties have to provide that provides a summary. There could be the consent of the surety for partial or full release. And those are things that would have to be reviewed as well. If there are liquidated damages due to schedule issues, that amount may show up as well at substantial or at final completion. So one of the things that's important about this is that final completion may involve several adjustments. And that's one of the reasons sometimes it can be very difficult to reach final payment, is that there are so many adjustments to be made, and that's involving the negotiation of the parties. So it's something so you have to take into account the timing of that and reaching final completion, resolving those punch list items, and making any adjustments that are needed in order to reach that final payment. So what is the timeline for this? This shows the contract language that the architect has 7 days after receipt of the application for payment to review and take action. And then there are 3 options that are spelled out here that provide a path forward depending on the circumstances. So the first would be that the architect is able to issue a certificate of payment for the full amount that was in the application for payment. And then that would be payment in full for the amount requested. There could be, under number 2, that there is a partial amount. And if that's the case, the architect would need to provide the reasons that it is not able to certify payment. And we referred earlier that there could be a preliminary step in this process, that if there's a sense that the architect will not be able to certify in full, to give notice of that and give time to correct issues if possible, because the third item would be withholding in full, meaning that there's some obstacle to releasing payment or items that add up to the full amount that require that payment is withheld. So the architect in this role is trying to protect the owner from paying for work that is non-conforming or making payment when there are serious issues under the agreement that would require withholding payment. So that in itself speaks to the importance of the contract provisions in defining the roles and responsibilities of the parties. So one of the things that sometimes comes up with this is that what if certification is made by all of the parties, the payment is issued, and then it's discovered that work that was subject to the payment application is in fact non-conforming. And the contract should spell out how that is to be resolved, because typically this process does not excuse non-conforming work. We looked at the language earlier that said the parties are certifying to the best of their knowledge, and that means that there could be things that will be discovered in the future that would still be considered non-conforming and would need to be remedied under the documents. And so the last provision here refers to issuing the certificate of payment, and then that triggers the owner's responsibility to make payment, and there is a time spelled out in the agreement for that. And then once the owner makes its payment and the contractor receives the payment, that triggers a responsibility on the part of the contractor to make payment to its subs and suppliers. And that time period will be spelled out in the agreements between the contractor and its subs and suppliers. And so this process is a transaction that involves many different documents and implicates a lot of the parties. And it's something that everyone has to think through from the outset. So the importance of planning is something that I think we've spoken to several times over the course of this presentation, and is of importance to the process.
All right, Josh, thank you. So we're nearing the end. I want to tell you about some of the documents that the AIA publishes that are relating to this. The AIA offers a variety of application for payment forms that correlate to the various families of documents and project delivery methods. The venerable G702 and G703, which we've been discussing today, were last updated in 1992. It's the most ubiquitous of all the AIA forms and is best suited for stipulated sum projects, but may be used for cost of work projects as well. There are also correlating subcontractor forms G702S and G703S, first published in 2017, which facilitate the payment of application process between subcontractors and the prime contractor. The G732 and G736 versions of the forms, specifically for construction manager as advisor projects, were updated in 2019. A family of forms suited to design build, the G742 and G743, along with versions for the design builder, the contractor, and the subcontractor, were all added in 2015. And later this year, 3 new forms will be introduced to better serve the cost of work projects. These are the G702 GMP form, which is tailored to the cost of the work projects with a guaranteed maximum price, the G702CW form for cost of the work projects without a guaranteed maximum price, and the G703CW continuation sheet, which complements both cost of the work form application forms. Thank you so much for your participation today. I'll now return the presentation back to Sarah Loomis for final comments and maybe a couple minutes of questions and answers.
All right, thank you very much, Mark and Josh. That was very informative and a lot of important stuff there. I just want to remind everyone that if you want to learn more, if you have any questions that you don't get a chance to ask today, then you can visit aiacontracts.org/learn. I also want to remind everyone that you'll be emailed the slides and recording from today's presentation. And it looks like we have about 10 minutes at the end here for questions. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type those into your questions box in GoToWebinar. I'll see how many Mark and Josh can answer for us today. So I'm going to read off a few that have come in, either for Mark or Josh to take on as answers. One that's come in is just a simple one. Earlier, I think it was Josh who mentioned DBE. Can you clarify what DBE stands for?
So we were looking earlier at requirements that may be part of the submission process and things that have to be provided. So there could be a disadvantaged business enterprise requirement for the project, and that may vary by jurisdiction. So the acronym may change, but the idea is that there may be a quota that the project has to fulfill in terms of contracts that are provided to disadvantaged businesses within the jurisdiction. If there's a municipality that's funding the project, a lot of times they will have requirements, and there may be documentation as part of that process that has to be verified. So if there's a DBE requirement coming from a funding source or from the owner itself, then you have to make sure that you are meeting that requirement. And then if there's documentation that has to be provided, you will often see it show up as part of perhaps the initial application for payment that has to be provided, or it may be something that's provided periodically throughout the project.
May I also want to mention, typically that's not documentation that the architect is going to review in detail, but if it's a municipality, they may have a DBE manager that is going to actually review and confirm compliance.
All right, thank you. The next question is an important one. Will the 2021 versions of the G702 and G703, so the cost of the work versions, will they be replacing the 1992 versions or the older versions of the G702 and G703, or can people still use those 1992 versions for their cost of the work projects?
No, it's not replacing anything in the past. Those versions will still be available. The new versions are just providing additional options for the parties depending on particular project needs. If there's something that's easier to document with a little more variation in the detail, as Mark was sharing, those will be additional options, but the typical versions will continue to be used and will be available.
All right. Another one is the 7 days for the certificate of application review and complete, is that business days or is that calendar days?
Good question. And the answer for that would be defined in the agreement itself. So there should be a definition in the agreement that will say that any reference in this document to a number of days refers to either calendar days or business days. If there are specific holidays or other things observed, it should also be spelled out. So you would need to make sure that you understand how your agreement deals with that issue. And that's something that may also show up in the architect's specifications. And you want to make sure that whatever you're dealing with in terms of definition for a number of days, that it is also consistent across all of the documents. So making sure that if there's something that's defined in the owner contractor agreement on that issue, then you would need to pick up the same definition in those other documents.
All right, thank you. Next one is when the retainage is ready to be paid out or released, how would this look on the pay application?
So what, you want me to take that, Josh? When the retainage on that would really be reflected primarily in the G702, and the retainage lines in the G702 would simply be changed to $0 when it's ready to be paid out. Usually that requires, depending on the jurisdiction, what is required to prove that all payments are made and there are no liens. Sometimes that's a lien waiver. Sometimes that's what we have in Louisiana is a clear and probate certificate from the clerk of courts. Different jurisdictions handle in different ways. But simply it would be zeroing out the line for retainage and just carrying those numbers down to indicate the payments due.
Right. And the other thing you may see is there are a lot of jurisdictions that are adopting some type of cap on retainage. There could be prompt payment requirements that may be in conflict with some of these requirements. So you want to make sure that there has been a review of statutes and jurisdiction requirements that may affect some of the ability of the parties to implement these types of provisions like retainage, or if it's payment to subs, that all of those contract requirements are in compliance with the jurisdiction.
All right, thank you both. We have about 3 minutes left. I have a question that came in that says, would it be possible to get some clarity on conditional and unconditional waivers?
Okay, that's pretty, that is confusing. That's a good question. The conditional waiver, as I've seen it used, is used for the monthly pay applications. And basically, the condition is simply that the contractor releases all claims against the owner on the condition that it has received prior payments. The unconditional is at the end of the project where it releases all claims upon receipt of the last payments. Josh, can you elaborate on that any further?
Yes, and so that's another issue where you have to be very well versed on the requirements of your jurisdiction, because even the terms conditional and unconditional could potentially have a different meaning depending on the law of the jurisdiction, but also the way it's defined on those forms themselves, because sometimes you will see what appears to be a conditional waiver, and then when you read the form, it may start to appear that the conditions are different from what you would expect. And so one of the concerns that you'll hear from the parties is making sure that if they are signing those waivers, that they are only signing with regard to payment that has already been received and not asking the parties to waive future payment. And so it really gets down to the timing, and it's also part of the jurisdictional requirements again.
All right, thank you both. It looks like that's all the time we're going to have in terms of questions. We have lots of good questions. You can always reach out to docinfo@aia.org to send along those questions and talk to one of our document specialists. Again, for now, we've reached the end of the hour, it looks like. So I just want to thank Mark and Josh for their time preparing this presentation and answering our questions. So thank you very much, Mark and Josh, and thank you, everybody.